Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is Linda Smith, and for those of you who don't know me, I am the director of the Early Childhood Initiative at the Bipartisan Policy Center here in Washington, D.C. And for those, again, who don't know BPC, we are a Washington, D.C. based think tank that tries to take the best ideas from both sides of the aisle to put forward policies and recommendations that might solve some of America's most pressing problems. One of those problems, obviously, is childcare. It continues to make the news. And also one that we're very interested in is childcare for our Native American children. So I want to welcome you to this webinar. It's the second in a two-part series, or four-part series, excuse me. The first one, Understanding Sovereignty, or this one, I'm sorry, Understanding Sovereignty, Tribal and State Collaboration, Making It Work for American Indians and Alaska Native Child Care. So we have an extremely interesting and I think exciting webinar for you today with several highly qualified and very special people. First, the Lieutenant Governor of the state of Minnesota, Peggy Flanagan. Second, Patina Parks, who is the director of the Tribal State Childcare Relations in the Office of the Governor of Minnesota. And finally, Melanie Benjamin, who is the chief executive for the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe in Minnesota. So with that in mind, I want to thank our sponsors and our funders for this, the Heising Simons Foundation, we sincerely appreciate their support for this work. If you missed the first in this series, I want to encourage you to go to our website or we're going to post in the link, a link to the first one where we featured Senator Byron Dorgan and Dr. Anton Truer, who have both written books that I highly recommend to you. The first, The Girl in the Photo by Senator Dorgan, and the second by Dr. Truer, which was Everything You Wanted to Know About Indians But Were Afraid to Ask. So those will be posted in the links in the chat as well. Co-hosting with me today is a longtime friend and colleague, Barb Faber, who is the CEO of Indigenous Visioning and a former tribal child care administrator on the White Earth Reservation. You're going to meet her again in a few minutes. So before I go on, I want to highlight something that we're doing today. Also, we're linking in the chat to a report that we're putting out today. Over the last year and a half, we have spent a considerable amount of time examining and comparing the 184 tribal childcare plans, which have not been made public, but we were, thank you to the people at HHS for giving us access, and to NICA for their help in sorting out what we needed to look at in these plans. We are issuing a report today called Righting a Wrong, Advancing Equity in Childcare Funding for AIAN Families. So you can go and look at the link on the website today or on the video. The report sets the stage for today's conversation, which with about over half actually of our AIAN children living off tribal lands, we have a need for more coordination and better coordination between states and tribes to make sure that these children get the services that they need and deserve. So with that in mind, we have been examining some of the things that we think are problems to some of that cooperation happening. And one of those things is the lack of understanding about what exactly tribal sovereignty really means. What does it mean to state officials? And what do they need to know about sovereignty that will help them do their work? So that's where we're going to start today's webinar, with an understanding, we hope, of what sovereignty really is. We had some time in the last couple of weeks to talk to Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan, who is herself a Native American and now in a key role in Minnesota in helping understand and create and drive better relations between the tribes in Minnesota and the state. So with that, we ask her to tell us what sovereignty means to her personally and to her in her role as Lieutenant Governor. And this is what she had to say to us.
Sovereignty to me simply means the right to govern ourselves, or the right to tribal governments to govern themselves and their people. I think in many ways, it's a word that is thrown around a lot, that people don't actually understand the full meaning of it. And so I'm in an interesting position, right? Being lieutenant governor, I consider myself to be a dual citizen. I am a citizen of the United States, but I am also a citizen of the white Earth Nation. And so that's the lens through which I look at, frankly, everything that we do. I can't stop being a Native woman, or put on one hat, or, and take off another. And so that is really, I think, the spirit that we've tried to bring into this work. But in my role as lieutenant governor, working in a state that shares geography with 11 Native nations, our role is really to ensure that we are working in a way that is truly government to government. And that takes a lot of work. We should have been doing this work, frankly, for the last 160 some years. It shouldn't take an Anishinaabe as the lieutenant governor to do it, but here we are, and we're going to do that work. Tribal nations should not be considered simply stakeholders. That's not who they are. The state needs to engage with tribes as governments. They're not simply another public interest group or another constituency. And I think that's really important for folks, to know. There's opportunities for us to partner with tribal nations, as we have. Around shared issues, interests, challenges, and that looks like communication, coordination, consultation, and to be really candid, that has never been more important than in the last 2 years. Mm-hmm. As we have all experienced the COVID-19 pandemic and all of the trauma and hardship that came with it. And the governor and I really look to the 11 tribal nations as our partners in this work. These tribal leaders have a unique understanding, in the same way that we do in the executive branch, making decisions that sometimes felt impossible. So being able to work together was really important. We learned from each other. There were things that our Native nations were doing within their enterprises and communities that we then adopted, and vice versa. So we know that tribes are also vaccinating their tribal members, but also non-tribal members or non-Native folks who might have lived with members and then just built that out to surrounding communities. And we're really partners in every aspect of how we faced the pandemic. So I think that, sovereignty in Minnesota during COVID really meant that tribes stepped fully into their responsibilities and did what they've always done. And that is make sure that they were caring for the most vulnerable people in the community, caring for each other, and making sure that work was happening also had a larger impact in the entire state. So, I'm a citizen of my tribe. I vote in elections. I'm impacted by the decisions that our tribal leaders make every day. And like, many Native people, I have to manage, right, that dual citizenship every day. But in this instance, I think there was just a lot for us to learn. And my hope is that is how other states are approaching this work as well. We are better off, not just when it comes to how we responded to COVID, but to issues around our children, our families, our missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. All of that work is better because tribes are our partners, and we are working government to government, not government at government. And it's really made a difference in our state. And my hope is that exists long after the governor and I are no longer in this office, that we have set the precedent for how this work should continue in this state.
Well, that is the first that you will hear from the Lieutenant Governor as we move into the next series of these webinars. You'll hear more from her, and I can't thank her enough for taking the time out of a very, I know, very busy and important schedule that she has to talk to us. Before I move on, I just want to remind everyone that if you have questions, that you can please post them in the chat on Facebook, on Twitter, or using pound BPC Live. So we're encouraging you to post your questions, should you have any, as we go through this. Now, as we move on, I'm going to introduce my longtime friend and colleague, Barb Faber. As I said, she's CEO and the Indigenous Visioning, and she started this effort herself. I want to say that she's been a long time supporter and real advocate at the federal level for childcare and early childhood for our Native American children. So Barb, I'm going to turn it over to you. You're going to introduce our next two guests. So it's over to you.
Miigwech. Thank you, Linda, for that nice intro. And yes, Linda and I have been working on tribal issues and for many years together, and we were able to get a lot done in Washington, D.C. And I'm hoping that this series would really help enlighten the potential of such strong partnerships between the tribes and the states. As we are serving the same geographic area, we are serving the same families. So I really appreciate that introduction and hope that you stay with us for all 4 sessions. Now it's my esteemed privilege to introduce another dear friend, Patina Park. Patina has a lot of history and serving tribal families in Minnesota here as a former Minnesota Indians Women's Resource Center director. You can read more about her bio. Patina, thank you for everything you've done, and we'd love to hear more information on tribal sovereignty and the historical portions of that. So Miigwech.
Palamia, thank you so much for having me on. I'm excited to work for the Lieutenant Governor, and also excited to kind of share a little background, because like she said, sovereignty is a word that's thrown around a lot, but there isn't a lot of understanding about it. So I really want to just kind of talk about what it is and how it applies, particularly in this work in early childhood and when you work with tribes. Now, like Lieutenant Governor said, I mean, really being a sovereign means you get to do what you want. You get to govern yourself. And a pure sovereign is truly free from any external control or anyone telling them what they should be doing. Here in the United States, we really have 3 sovereigns. We have the federal government, we have the state government, and then in between the two, we have the tribal government that has different levels of kind of control and authority depending on the area, which is also why federal Indian law can be a lot of fun, but also very confusing. Now, the United States Constitution has a lot in it about how the federal government should intercept and work with the states, but there's very little in it about tribes. And, you know, we could go back and try to analyze that, but from my perspective and in my, you know, learning of history and learning from my elders and others, I mean, it's pretty clear that in the beginning of this country, they did not think the tribes would be around, certainly not until where we are now. And so there isn't a lot in there about us to kind of define the relationship. We have the Commerce Clause, where Congress has the power to regulate between the foreign nations and Indian tribes. And then we have the treaty power, treaties being very important in some parts of the country, but want to acknowledge too that of the 574 federally recognized tribes, a lot of them do not have a treaty with the United States. So to assume that they do would not be accurate. But when we look at the federal tribal relationship, the United States Supreme Court, which has a lot of authority and has done a lot of interpretation of our power, has interpreted that two sections in the Constitution to mean that the federal government has exclusive authority over the tribes to regulate both our affairs, our trade. Laws are passed that have huge impact. And then Congress has been given and recognized to have plenary power, which means Congress at any point could go into session and pass a law that would abrogate treaty rights, that would terminate tribes, that could either remove authority or even give authority back. And this power is completely exclusive of any state interference. So, the relationship the tribes have, first and foremost, are really with the federal government, because the federal government has so much authority with them. This is also why when you look at kind of the hierarchy of authority and sovereignty, tribal sovereignty is at a higher level than state sovereignty, because the states are part of the United States of America. So if the federal government were to collapse for some reason, the tribal sovereign governments would not collapse with it, because they have existed since before there was a United States of America. And I think that's important for people who are working with the tribes to really understand that the tribes do not have their sovereignty because the federal government gave it to them. Tribes are sovereign nations because they have always been sovereign nations for hundreds and thousands of years before anybody came over to this side of the globe. So let's talk a little bit about treaties, though, because here is where we have the biggest flaw and kind of confusing issue within tribal or federal Indian law, because a treaty is an agreement between two sovereigns. A state government cannot make a treaty. Only federal governments, international, federally recognized level of government, so Italy, Spain, Canada, can create treaties between the United States. And so here within the United States, a treaty era with the tribes was from 1778, obviously, when the United States became, into 1871. And those treaties have very common themes, creating peace. A lot of land was exchanged. So when we think of treaty obligation and treaty rights, they were bought. They were bought with large swaths of land that the tribes gave up. And I think that's something else we tend to forget when we think of treaty rights as state governments, as being kind of this obligation we have that we had nothing to do with. But the states themselves would not exist if it weren't for these agreements and the tribes giving up a lot of land, most of which was stolen because these treaties, if we got into it, weren't always authorized by the right person. They have all been violated in some ways by the federal government. And so even though treaties under the United States Constitution are the supreme law of the land, they trump state law, they trump congressional law, they trump executive order, except in Indian law. For Indian treaties, Congress can still go in, pass laws, and change them, adapt them, interpret them in ways that takes more and more authority away from tribes. But regardless of the federal government, regardless of treaties, tribes have what's called inherent sovereignty. And that is just speaking to what I said earlier. Because tribes were sovereign, governed themselves, for millennia before there was any colonialization or colonization here in the United States, it's just there. It's an essential characteristic, and it's there. If it hasn't been extinguished by a federal act of Congress, then those powers are there and just continue to flow. So the power to, regulate the behavior of your members, citizenship, how do we define an enrolled member? Taxation actually is considered an inherent power of a sovereign, right? It's not given by anyone. And so when you hear people even say, those rights were given to the tribes, or I don't know why we have to deal with the tribes, it's important to remember that, they have to deal back right? Because it is more of a sense of diplomacy between the state and the tribes rather than tribes being part of the state. Nothing actually makes the hair on the back of my neck kind of go up and make me want to like start arguing with someone than when I hear some kind of state official or even a federal official say something like my tribes or our tribes, because tribes do not belong to the states. They do not belong to the federal government. Tribal nations share land with the states and with the federal government instead. It's important to really look at all this from a historical context. And I don't have time to go through all this. Like any one of these eras is a dissertation. And so I show this for people who are going to work with tribes as a kind of a challenge to you, that you go in and look up each of these different sections and see how it impact on the tribes that you are working with. Everything from the colonization in the beginning all the way to where we are now among self-determination. You know, a lot happened in a relatively short period of time to tribal nations, and particularly when you look at the late 1800s into the early 1900s, from the reservation into the land loss. You know, we still have members that are alive that experienced the boarding schools, that experienced pretty intense trauma. And so you have to appreciate that and understand it when you're working with tribal nations, so that you can respect that history, respect the role that the state or your agency played in it, and not ignore it or try to what we call whitewash over it. Now, this is a video I just love to show. It's from eHistory, that really displays in a visual way how the United States kind of took over the land and the tribes. So I'm going to ask that the video be played here. It's less than a minute. There's no sound, but it's powerful to see just what we were to where it is now. So as that video showed, we went from quite a bit of land and lost a lot of it. And most of that is stolen, is considered stolen land. So also being respectful of that as we interact with the tribes, and just to understand that as a state, you know, there are tribal nations that lost land in order for the creation of that state, but the tribes have been stewards and caregivers of that land for a very long time. And so they're good partners as you co-manage those shared areas. Now, state and tribe, as they interact, you know, could a state or a tribe use their shared border to exercise their authority over? Well, not generally, right? There's a lot of complexity in that, but the important message is they are two separate governments. However, remember that all the tribal citizens are also state citizens. So the state can't ignore its obligation to those tribal members just because they're enrolled members of a tribe as well. Like Lieutenant Governor Flanagan said, she's a dual citizen, both with the state and with the tribe. And as the governing bodies, each sovereign has a responsibility to that citizen. But states and tribes can absolutely define how they're going to work together. having agreements, communicate, cooperate. And that's what's the most important thing, that those lines of communication start and those shared interests and shared goals are really highlighted, because the tribes and the state can be really powerful partners. And I think the Lieutenant Governor really highlighted that, how important it was for Minnesota, even during the COVID crisis. And so, the well-being of our families, our children, natural resources, just the safety, security, there are so many interests that we share that we can work together on while still respecting each other as separate sovereigns, and through that kind of reciprocity. But I would say both to states and to tribes is to learn more about each other. So making it too one-sided from either way, like at the government, is not going to build a strong partnership. Because if the two can partner together collectively, then the response with that combined resource can really make a difference for our families, particularly for our children. Whether it's early childhood or Indian child welfare or whatever, because our children, for both sovereigns, they really are the most important resource that any of us have. And really, we need to acknowledge them as such. And so I want to thank you for listening to me. This is my contact information. And of course, if there's any questions that we don't have time during this session, to reach out, and I'll follow up to the best of my ability. Thanks so much, Barb and Linda.
Thank you, Patina. That was wonderful. Wonderful history, wonderful explanation of dual citizenship and what sovereign nations mean. So now I would like to take this opportunity, and again, if you have questions for Patina, feel free to put them in the chat. So now I would like to take this moment to introduce our next presenter. Chief Executive Benjamin, Melanie, is a chairwoman of Mille Lacs Reservation here in Minnesota. She's a leader. She's been elected and nominated to her position several times over the years because of her dedication and leadership to tribal sovereignty and her tribe. So when we interviewed Chief Executive Melanie Benjamin, she shared what her thoughts are on what tribal sovereignty is and how states and tribes can work together for citizens both on reservation lands and off reservation lands in the urban communities. We have many, many, many tribal members from all nations who live off the reservation lands and in urban communities. And we need to provide support to them in any way possible, and by states and tribes working together to support them, we are able to work together to provide the services that they need. So without much and without any more time here, I'd like to introduce Executive Benjamin and share her words.
Ani Buju, Mino Gijigad Nungum, Mandaman Indigenous Cause, Melanie Benjamin Indigo. Good morning. My name is Melanie Benjamin, and I am the Chief Executive for the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe. And I'm an elected official, and I first got elected in 2000, 2004, 2008, 2012, 2016, and 2020. So it's been an honor that the people of the Mille Lacs Band have put their faith in me as the Chief Executive. So I'm really honored that I have that ability to speak on behalf of the Mille Lacs Band and to look at initiatives that will promote our sovereignty and making sure that whatever I do today has a positive impact 7 generations from today. Well, if you think about tribal sovereignty, in all of the 580 nations that there are in the United States, we are governments. So if you look at the governments in the United States, it's the federal government, it's the tribal government, and then it's state governments. So a lot of times, because our history or our status as governments, sovereign nations, are not taught in our educational system, many people don't know that. And then when they are exposed to it, they don't understand. It's like the state of Minnesota, any of the departments, like going to Wisconsin and saying, here we are, and so here's our initiative, so follow them, state of Wisconsin. And of course, that would never happen.
Mhm.
And it would be more of going and establishing a working relationship. And I think that's one of the things that tribes, because we are here under what is considered the state of Minnesota, even though it is Indian country, that we want to have good working relationships with our state government. And under this administration, Governor Walz and Lieutenant Peggy Flanagan, as I noted earlier, I first came into elected office in 2000 and have worked with many administrations from the state of Minnesota. And by far, this is the most, I don't know exactly how I want to say it, but they recognize tribal sovereignty. They work with us government to government. And I really appreciate that. And I've never had that opportunity with any state governor since my tenure as chief executive. For the Mille Lacs Band, we decided that we needed to extend the opportunity for our citizens that live in the metro area of Minneapolis, St. Paul. So we actually opened up an office and staffed it with individuals. And so those program administrators have the responsibility of working with the state and other organizations throughout the state that provide services. So we link up those opportunities. And then also the Mille Lacs Band will provide services as well in terms of, we have different programs that are housed in our urban office that we open those up for our tribal members, and any of the programs that we offer on the reservation, that is the link. If you're interested in housing or you want a home loan or things of that sort, you can have the opportunity to get all of those services through our urban offices. So that's very important to us that we extended that. Otherwise, people have to come to the reservation to get the services. We have the clinics, schools, our businesses, but we wanted to at least extend as much as we could. And we couldn't do all of it, of course, just based on capacity. But there are so many excellent organizations in the urban areas that our program administrators can link up with and then provide the opportunity, the knowledge, the education that our members need to utilize those services as well. We are looking at how do we provide additional services. And then we operate a federal program called 477. It's Angie, but I can't even, Angie program anyway. Apologize for that. I have a twisted tongue this morning. And so under the Angie program, there's a list of all kinds of services. And a lot of those will be benefits that individuals can apply for and utilize. We would be the support to those members to utilize childcare or things of those sort as well. But you have to be a client of the 477 program. And otherwise, there just isn't that ability to just say, I want childcare. I go into the urban office and there you are. There's just like any other government program, you have to apply, you have to meet the criteria, and then we work with you as a client to help you meet your needs.
Mm-hmm. So you would pay for their childcare if they were a client in the Twin Cities?
there's a lot of different kind of services that would happen. And I can't be really specific because each individual would have a different need. But depending on what that would be and how they qualify under that ANGI program, there is just a vast ability to take care of a lot of those needs. And again, I think the biggest problem is people don't know that. And just communicating that information is so difficult sometimes.
Okay, well, thank you so much on that. And we sincerely appreciate the time for that piece. We had one more question that we asked the Chief Executive Officer she could give some information about, and we're already getting questions on this one in the chat. What advice would you give to other states and to tribes in terms of this type of relations that you obviously have that are so good in Minnesota? What would you say to tribes about this in other states and to states? And so here was her answer to that question.
That at the implementation level of a lot of the state offices, that those individuals would recognize that the Mille Lacs Band is a sovereign nation. And so we have also our own laws, rules, and regulations. And we have to learn the state rules and regulations. We can't just show up on the doorstep and say, here we are. We have to learn, and we have to follow all the guidelines that are set forth to utilize services. And so I would like to see that as well. Like I did mention, we have an excellent relationship with the governor and the lieutenant governor and the staff at that level. And tribal liaisons that are here in the state of Minnesota on the different departments, we work well with. But when you get down to the level of when you're trying to implement these services, a lot of times people don't understand that there is federal Indian law, and we follow federal law at every aspect. And we also follow state law, but we also follow band law. And so there's always those levels, and just to recognize that and respect that. And if you do and learn a little bit about it, then you would understand that as well. But I think that's very important too, is when you look at the different levels of state government, and when you're at the level of implementing services as a state employee, you will treat everybody the same. And if you look at, and there's nothing wrong with treating everybody the same to make sure that all the rules and regulations are following, but it's how you communicate that, and how you recognize the differences of how people think. We have what our elders tell us is an Ojibwe thought process. And so that process is not necessarily the same as yours. And also, if you're a first speaker, the words do not translate to English word by word. So when you're trying to process that information, sometimes it gets a little muddled as you're going on. And I loved when you said that leadership matters, because again, with the state of Minnesota, I've never dealt with the governor or a lieutenant governor that are so open, that work with Indian nations here in a government to government relationship and respect us. And for example, when we were during the height of the pandemic, when everybody had to shut down businesses and we were all devastated, the governor initiated daily calls with the tribes to provide a constant communication of information back and forth. And so that got us through pretty good. And even still today, we still have those weekly meetings with the office of the governor and the lieutenant governor. And we are constantly talking about issues that we need to have corrected, that we're appreciative of. And a lot of times we have people that will implement policies and procedures that are in violation of laws that the tribes have to follow as well. And we have another issue with the state where there was no communication on an issue, and now it's kind of boiled up. But because I can talk to the governor directly, we can get these resolved without it being a big, big issue. And that's so important. And for a governor to take the time to constantly communicate with the heads of the governments here in the tribal governments here in the state of Minnesota is just outstanding. And we know from that communication, if there's any federal issues that the state is going to be involved in, our governor always makes sure we're aware of it and is a part of whatever that may be. So my advice to other tribes throughout the nation is to look at the Minnesota model and communicate with us as well. And we can tell you best practices that we've acquired working with our governor and our lieutenant governor, and also to initiate that communication, send out the correspondence, invite the governor and the other legislatures in the state to come to your reservation to learn a little bit, explain how your government operates. Because again, each of the tribes will have their own governing best practices and processes, and they're all different. And of course, there's land bases, there's population that are going to be totally different. But if the tribes haven't had that that opportunity to have a good working relationship with the governor, then I think this would be a good way to do it as well. And we look at other states as well and what works in other states. And we share that with the governor, and I'm sure his staff does as well. And it's, if you have, as a tribal government, if you have to take the first step, do it. And having that excellent working relationship with your state government really benefits all the citizens. Because as was mentioned, we have our members, our tribal members that live on the reservation, but they also live off the reservation. And we want to make sure that they are receiving all the services that they are eligible, regardless if they live on the reservation and off, because they are still state citizens as well as tribal citizens.
Wow, so much in those remarks packed into this. As I said when we opened, there's so much information here. We're going to move now to questions, and we do have a couple of questions immediately for Patina. Patina, the first question that we got is, do other states have a position like yours? Do you work with those states and share strategies for successful state tribal communications?
Yeah, thank you for that. Yes, other states do have similar positions. We've actually reached out to Arizona, to South Dakota, North Dakota, Wisconsin, and are trying to connect with others. We don't have like a association yet of people who do this role. So there isn't a lot of shared strategy going on. Also, the different states really have kind of different focuses of that position. I think Chief Executive Benjamin summed it up very nicely by saying, like, Minnesota is doing pretty remarkable work, because rather than limit this office in this role, we really are trying to treat it like international diplomacy as we reach out to the tribes, and those daily calls, let me tell you, were something to manage, but they really were so important during the COVID response. And now as we meet weekly, we have, the weekly call with all the tribal leaders and their staff. We have the Friday legislative calls now during the legislative session, but trying to keep those, the communication paths open is really how we view this role, and also now future planning on how to keep this position and this office permanently within the state of Minnesota, because at this point, if at the end of the year, the governor and the lieutenant governor did not win re-election, my position would most likely go away, and all that work at the governor's level would cease to exist. So also trying to figure out, even in the next 6-7 months, how we can really solidify the work we've been doing, like the lieutenant governor said, so it continues on regardless of who is governor, and also regardless of whether they support tribes or not. We still want the work to continue, and hopefully they'll learn why it's important during their term.
The other question, Patina, was that in your slides, you said something about tribal sovereignty or self-determination. And how is self-determination different from sovereignty?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's something like a lot of people way smarter than I am have written extensively about. I can say that the word sovereignty is used internationally. Ukraine, as we talk about the Ukraine and what's happening there, that, Russia has invaded a sovereign nation, meaning that they're independent. Sovereignty, though, is grounded in European, like its history goes back into kind of cultures and governing areas that isn't natural to tribal governments at all. So it's kind of placed on us, and we're quasi-sovereigns here within the United States because of this weird interplay between the Supreme Court interpreting and the Congress being able to pass laws that impact us. And so self-determination really is a stronger, purer word in my view, is what the tribes are able to do. Like, they have the right to make decisions so that they're self-determining their future, their community, how they even interact with a state or federal government. And so for tribal governments, I have so much respect that they really have to maneuver a very complicated minefield of trying to expand and be as strong for their community as possible, knowing that the federal government at any point could say, no, you can't do that, or this violates this. And then if you have a bad relationship with the state government, then you're kind of fighting those fights that are unnecessary. And so, self-determination is what I think tribes should strive for. But sovereignty is just the word that we use to kind of put ourselves at an international level, like the treaties identified when they were made with us.
Mm-hmm. Well, we just got another one, and that's a very interesting one, and I'm anxious to hear your actual response to this myself. It says, does the United States have a higher obligation to provide childcare for Native Americans as opposed to the general public, i.e. legislation for universal childcare?
Whenever there's a question of does the federal government have a higher obligation, no matter what follows, I say yes. But that's my bias, right? I'm a Native woman who studied history for a very long time. But I would say the federal government really has an obligation to support the tribes in the way that they want to provide childcare for their members. And so things like, very shortened service areas where they're not able to expand into urban areas, that to me violates their responsibility to the tribe and to tribal children. But also making sure that the families that are not necessarily connected very closely to their tribes, like all of those urban families that were subject to removal during the 50s and relocation, also ensuring that those families have access to childcare on their own and not having to be combined with all other marginalized communities. And it's an and, not an either, right? There are enough, like if we can go to war in a blink of an eye and spend billions of dollars a day, we certainly could prioritize childcare at a level where all children would have the access to it, regardless of their parents, regardless of the situation at all, and just see it as a need for children, not workforce development or kind of the other areas we see it kind of highlighted.
Mm-hmm. One other question here, and this is interesting, is between, can you comment on, because of the special relationship between the state and the tribal governments, what is the relationship between the tribes and state legislators?
Mm. That is also a really good question because, the legislators, many come from areas that may not have a good understanding of kind of tribal uh, governments, self-determination, sovereignty, federal Indian law, et cetera. And so it's really important too for legislators to educate themselves. I know there was a training, and there's a tribal state relations training that's done through the state, has been for a while in partnership with the University of Minnesota. And, all the state employees who interact with tribes have to take it, but they have created a version for legislators. And I know the House participated in it. I'm not sure if the Senate has yet, but it really is a good way to kind of open their eyes, because there are so many times the legislature will pass laws not appreciating or understanding how it's going to impact tribes. And then unfortunately, tribes get the shorter end of the stick often. So they will use a county area for population and direct some funds or some efforts to that county, but they don't consider that many of the county's membership is actually tribally enrolled members. And so the county may or may not serve them.
Mhm.
So unless they're directed to and they're held accountable to, oftentimes those people get lost in kind of this government uncertainty of who is serving who. And we hear that too, like, well, why don't you go to the reservation and get that service? Like I said earlier, we're citizens of the state too. And so there are still obligations to us and our families as a citizen of the state that have nothing to do with the fact we're enrolled member of some other tribe.
Mhm. That's very interesting. I'm sure that's a one that is going to, in most states, take a lot of, understanding and education. There's no question. One, I think that this one is a pretty easy one. It just asks, what can the average citizen do in a state to help support tribes within, that they're around or within their state?
Yeah, I think the very first thing everyone should do is actually research the tribes that are within your area, who are here now and those who were there before. Because many states, especially out east, they may not have many tribes within their borders, but they are the ancestral lands of tribes, for instance, that are now in Oklahoma. I think, 20 years ago, it was understandable if people didn't know much about us because we have been pretty erased from textbooks, from, turning on the TV. You don't see us very often. But now, there really is no reason why. You can Google just about anything and find good information easily if you want to, right? And there's so many more books out there that give a basic understanding, and then you just keep learning. I have been teaching varying areas of federal Indian law and history now for about 20 years. And every time I prepare for a new training, I learn something new. So, the learning is lifelong. And it's just, I think ultimately don't be afraid and ask questions too. Most tribal governments, tribal people welcome the questions. That's better than having misunderstandings or, stereotypes placed on us that have a negative impact on how our families and children receive services. But just learn, ask questions.
And this is one of the things that I think I learned, and I think others who watched the earlier and this particular webinar learned, is that you really need to just ask the questions and don't assume anything. And I think if nothing else, I've learned that from all of the presenters over the last 2 webinars, and we hope to in the ones coming up. Patina, we really appreciate you taking this time out of your very busy schedule. And hopefully, if we have more questions come in, we can direct them to you, or they can contact you directly. We don't want to get you slammed with questions. On the other hand, we do think that this is such an important topic because we believe this is a real barrier to our children getting the services they need if people don't understand these issues. So hopefully this will move the needle forward in this country, and that you were a big part of it. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
I'm going to turn it now to Barb. If you wanted to have any final closing words that you'd like to say about this before we close it out.
Well, I would like to thank the Bipartisan Policy Center for raising this conversation between tribes and states. I know we have a couple of really interesting interviews with some state officials coming up at our next event. So I hope you all can join us at the in about a month for our third event. There's also opportunity. Some states and tribes, and between the federal government and tribes, there are tribal consultations. And many states do have those, initiate those. So we encourage people to attend those, to learn more of the issues that are local issues. And the federal government, as I said, also has tribal consultations on their federal programs that affect families. So we encourage you to also find out those, and those are typically posted. So please find out more information on those and attend our next event. So we hope these series encourage tribal and state partnerships and collaboration and open the communication so that we're serving all children and families, no matter where they are. So thank you again, Linda and your team, and Patina, and Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan, and Chief Executive Melanie Benjamin.
Okay, well, thank you, Barb, and for all the hard work on this, and ditto to the thanks to all of the people who helped us with this. As Barb said, the next in the series we will be showcasing states that have really done some outstanding things in terms of working with tribes, getting into the level of early childhood and childcare. And we do have some excellent models out there that we hope people can learn from. So until the next time, I want to just again point you to the report that we just put online today, where we talk about the funding for childcare and what we found as we examined the tribal childcare plans. It's a long study, but I think it points out many things that need to get fixed in our country when it comes to early childhood and childcare. Chief among them, understanding, sort of the scope of the program, of the problem, and where do we go from there. So with that in mind, we invite everybody to stay tuned for the third of these. And again, thank you everyone for joining us today. And that will be it until next month.